The plate hit the floor and shattered, and the whole kitchen went silent. Elsie froze with her hands still shaped around the space where the plate had been. She was 10 years old, small for her age, and she knew exactly what a broken plate cost in this house. Not in coins, in something worse. She dropped to her knees and began gathering the pieces with her bare fingers, fast, before anyone could come through the door. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. The door opened anyway. But it was not Master Grant who stepped into the kitchen. It was a stranger, a tall man in a dark traveling cloak, with road dust on his boots and eyes the color of storm clouds. He filled the doorway the way mountains fill a horizon. Elsie had never seen him before, but her body understood something before her mind did, because every instinct she had told her to lower her eyes. This man was not an ordinary traveler. He was the Alpha King. Edward Stone, king of the northern Pax, ruler of every wolf from the Silver Coast to the Frost Mountains, had arrived at the Silver Moon Inn, without a single trumpet, without a single banner, and without any warning at all. That was how he liked to travel. He had learned long ago that people showed you their true faces only when they did not know you were coming. He looked down at the small girl kneeling among the broken pieces of the plate, and something in his chest went very still. She was gathering the sharp pieces with her bare hands, not because she was careless, but because she was rushing. Rushing the way a person rushes when they are afraid of being caught. Her sleeves were too long for her arms, pulled down over her wrists even in the heat of the kitchen. Her hair was tied back with a piece of string, and her eyes, when they flicked up at him for half a second, were the eyes of someone much older than 10. He had seen eyes like that before, on soldiers, on survivors. Never on a child holding pieces of a plate. Before he could speak, the inner door burst open, and a round, smiling man came sweeping in, wiping his hands on a spotless apron. Harold Grant, the owner of the Silver Moon Inn, was famous in the border town of Ashford for his warm welcome, his generous donations to the town hall, and his kindness in taking in an orphan girl when no one else would. He was the sort of man everyone described as good. He said good morning to everyone. He remembered birthdays. He gave bread to the poor on festival days. He took one look at the stranger's fine boots and expensive cloak, and his smile grew 3 sizes. "Welcome, welcome, honored guest," he said, spreading his arms. "Forgive the mess. The girl is clumsy, but we love her anyway. She is like a daughter to me." Elsie did not look up. She kept picking up pieces, faster now. Edward watched her hands. He watched the way her shoulders had climbed up toward her ears the moment Grant's voice entered the room. He watched the way she made herself smaller, the way a rabbit makes itself smaller when a hawk's shadow crosses the grass. "Like a daughter," Edward repeated slowly, tasting the words. "Just like one," Grant said. "Poor thing lost her parents to the winter fever 3 years back. I could not let her go to the workhouse. What kind of man would I be?" "What kind indeed," Edward said. Grant did not hear the ice underneath the words. He was too busy calculating the price of the stranger's cloak. He clapped his hands and ordered Elsie to fetch the best wine and prepare the finest room, and Elsie was gone through the back door before he finished the sentence, moving with the speed of someone who had learned that slowness had a price. Edward let himself be led into the dining hall. He let Grant seat him at the best table by the fire. He let the man talk and talk and talk about the town, about the harvest, about the new road the council was building. Edward gave short, polite answers, and revealed nothing about who he was. To Harold Grant, he was simply a wealthy traveler named Edward, a merchant of northern furs, passing through on business. Kings learn many skills. The most useful one is patience. The dining hall filled as evening came. Farmers, traders, the blacksmith and his sons, 2 old women who ran the wool shop. It was a friendly room, loud with laughter, warm with firelight. On the surface, Ashford looked like the happiest town in the north. But Edward had spent 20 years reading rooms the way scholars read books, and this room had a strange sentence written in it. Every few minutes, the kitchen door would swing open, and the small girl would come through it, carrying trays that were too heavy for her arms, bowls of stew stacked 3 high, jugs of cider in both hands, plates balanced up her forearms like a tavern worker of 30 years' experience. She never stopped. She never sat. She never ate. Other serving staff came and went, took breaks, chatted with the guests. The girl did not. She moved through the room like a small ghost that everyone had agreed not to see. And that was the strange sentence. No one saw her. Not one person in that warm, friendly room ever looked at her directly. When she set their food down, their eyes slid over her head. When she squeezed between chairs with a loaded tray, they moved without acknowledging her. A whole town of kind, decent, church-going people had somehow trained themselves not to look at one small girl. People do not look away from nothing, Edward thought. People look away from things they do not want to see. The fire popped. Somewhere behind him, a pot clattered in the kitchen, and he watched the girl, halfway across the room with a tray, flinch so hard the cups rattled. Her eyes shot to Grant, who was laughing with a table of traitors. Only when she saw that he had not noticed did she breathe again. Edward's wolf, the ancient thing that lived beneath his skin, lifted its head and growled softly. Not yet, he told it. Watch first. He stayed at his table long after his plate was empty. He ordered another drink he did not want, just to have a reason to sit. Around midnight, the hall emptied out. Grant counted the coins from the till twice, smiling at the total, and then called out toward the kitchen in a voice that was still pleasant, but had a new weight underneath it, the way a hand can be gentle right up until it closes. Girl, the floors, all of them. Before morning. Yes, Master Grant, came the small voice. Grant noticed Edward still sitting by the fire and switched his smile back on like a lamp. Forgive us, sir. She stays up late by her own choice. She loves to work, that one. I tell her to rest, but children, you know how they are. I know exactly how they are, Edward said. Grant laughed as if something funny had been said, wished him a good night, and climbed the stairs to his own warm room, humming. Edward remained by the dying fire. Through the crack of the kitchen door, he could see a small shadow moving back and forth across the floor, with a brush and a bucket, at midnight, on her knees, in a house that called her a daughter. He thought about the bruise he had glimpsed that afternoon. Just for a second, when she reached across his table with the water jug and her long sleeve slipped, marks on her thin wrist, shaped like fingertips. She had yanked the sleeve down so fast, so smoothly, that he understood it was a practiced motion. She had hidden marks before, many times. A child does not learn to hide bruises in a house full of love. Edward Stone had planned to stay in Ashford for one night. In the morning, he was expected at the border fort, and after that, the council in the capital, and after that, 100 duties that pulled at a king like tides pull at the shore. He rose from his chair, walked to the front desk, and rang the small bell. Grant hurried back down the stairs, tying his robe, delighted at the thought of more coin. Yes, sir? Is the room not to your liking? The room is fine, Edward said. I find I like your town. I will be staying a few more days, perhaps a week. Grant's face lit up with pure greed. Wonderful, sir. Wonderful. You will not regret it. Ashford is the friendliest town in the north. Ask anyone. I intend to, Edward said quietly. I intend to ask everyone. He climbed the stairs to his room, and behind him, in the kitchen, the small shadow kept scrubbing, unaware that the most powerful man in the northern kingdoms had just cancelled a week of royal business because of a slipped sleeve, a flinch, and a broken plate. The Alpha King had noticed. And when an Alpha King notices something, the world is never quite the same afterward. Morning came gray and cold, and Edward was already awake when the first rooster crowed. He had slept lightly, the way he always did in unfamiliar places, and twice in the night he had heard footsteps on the floor below. Small, quick footsteps. The girl had still been working when the moon went down. He came downstairs to find the dining hall already spotless, the fire already built, and fresh bread already cooling on the counter. The smell of it filled the whole inn, warm and sweet with honey. Whoever had baked it had a gift. He would have said so out loud, except the baker was nowhere to be seen, and Harold Grant was standing behind the counter, accepting compliments from 2 traders as if the bread had risen from his own hands. My secret recipe, Grant said, tapping the side of his nose, passed down from my dear mother. Edward said nothing. He sat at the same table as the night before and waited. She appeared a few minutes later, coming through the kitchen door with a tray of bowls. In daylight he could see her more clearly, and what he saw made his jaw tighten. Her cheeks were hollow in the way that comes from years of eating last and least. There were shadows under her eyes that no child should carry. Her dress had been mended so many times that the patches had patches, but her hands were steady, and her chin was up, and she moved through her work with a quiet dignity that struck him harder than tears would have. She reached his table with a bowl of porridge and a small pot of honey. "Good morning, sir," she said softly. It was clearly a rule of the house, a greeting she was required to give. But then she did something that was not required. She noticed that his tea had gone cold while he waited, and without being asked, she took the cup, returned with a hot one, and set it down without a word, without expecting thanks, without even seeming to realize she had done anything at all. Small kindness, Edward thought, from someone who has received almost none. That is the rarest kind there is. "Thank you," he said. She looked up, startled. Actually startled, as if the words were in a foreign language. For a heartbeat, her eyes met his, brown and wide and far too careful, and then she remembered herself and dropped her gaze. "You are welcome, sir," she whispered, and turned to go. That was when it happened. She reached across the table to collect the empty water jug from the night before, and her sleeve, the long sleeve she kept tugging down, caught on the corner of the jug's handle and slid up her arm. Edward did not move. He did not stare. Kings learn to see everything while appearing to see nothing, and in the space of a single second, he saw it all. The marks on her wrist were not from a fall. Falls do not leave 4 small round bruises in a row on one side and a single one on the other. Those were fingertips. An adult hand had gripped that thin arm hard enough to leave its shape behind, and the colors told him it had happened more than once, because some of the marks were fresh and dark, while others had faded to yellow and green, layers of them, old ones underneath new ones, like rings inside a tree, each one recording a season of the same storm. The girl yanked her sleeve down. The motion was fast, smooth, automatic. Her face did not change at all. That was the part that made his blood turn slow and cold. She was not embarrassed. She was not surprised. She had simply performed a maintenance task, the way a soldier straightens his armor, and moved on with the jug held against her chest like a shield. Across the room, Harold Grant was watching. Edward saw it in the polished brass plate on the wall, the reflection of the innkeeper's face turned toward the girl, his eyes narrow, his famous smile absent for just a moment. Grant had seen the sleeve slip, and in that unguarded second, before the smile snapped back into place, his expression was not concern. It was calculation. It was the look of a man checking whether his secret was still safe. Then a traitor called for more cider, and Grant was jolly again, booming with laughter, and the room was warm and bright and pleasant, and the whole thing might never have happened. But it had happened, and Edward Stone forgot nothing. He spent the morning being an easy guest. He complimented the food. He asked harmless questions about wool prices and grain shipments. He let Grant believe he had impressed the wealthy fur merchant. And all the while, he watched the machinery of the inn, and the more he watched, the more wrong it became. The girl, whose name he learned was Elsie when a delivery boy called it through the back door, did the work of 3 grown adults. She hauled water from the well, split kindling with a hatchet nearly as long as her arm, plucked chickens, scrubbed pots, served tables, and ran errands into town at a jog, because walking would have taken too long. The 2 other workers at the inn, a slow-moving man who tended the stable and a woman who did the laundry, treated her not unkindly, but not kindly either. They treated her the way people treat a chair, useful, present, not a person. At noon, a wagon wheel broke in the yard, and a crate of wine bottles crashed onto the stones. It was entirely the wagon driver's fault, and everyone saw it, and no one said otherwise. But Edward, watching from the window, saw Grant step out into the yard, look at the mess, and then look at Elsie, who had been feeding the chickens 20 feet away. Grant did not shout. That was the thing Edward would remember later, the thing that told him what kind of man he was truly dealing with. Grant walked over to the girl, bent down close to her ear with his back to the street so no passerby could see his face, and spoke to her quietly for perhaps 10 seconds. Edward could not hear the words. He did not need to. He watched the color drain out of the girl's face, watched her nod and keep nodding, watched her whisper something that was almost certainly an apology for a thing she had not done. Then Grant straightened up, ruffled her hair for the benefit of 2 women passing on the street, and called out cheerfully, "Accidents happen, my dear. Do not worry yourself." The women smiled at the sweet scene. "What a good man," one of them said to the other, taking in that orphan like he did. Edward stepped back from the window and stood very still in the middle of his room. He had ruled for 2 decades. He had faced rogue packs in the Frost Mountains, treacherous lords at his own council table, and a war at the southern border that had cost him half his family. He knew evil when it came howling across a battlefield with its teeth bared. This was his first time watching it wear an apron and hand out bread to the poor. That evening, he wrote a letter, sealed it with plain wax instead of the royal seal, and paid a courier to carry it north to the border fort, where his beta, a sharp, quiet man named Peter Hale, was waiting for him, with an escort of royal guards. The letter was short. Delayed in Ashford. Come alone, dressed as a traitor. Bring the record clerk. Tell no one where the king is. He signed it with a single letter and watched the courier ride into the dusk. Downstairs, the dinner crowd was gathering, and the kitchen door was swinging, and a small girl with hidden bruises was carrying trays too heavy for her arms through a room full of people who had all, somehow, agreed to be blind. Edward came down to dinner with a merchant's easy smile on his face and a king's cold fire behind his eyes. Enjoy your last quiet days, Harold Grant, he thought, as the innkeeper waved him toward the best table by the fire. Winter is coming for you, and you are busy counting coins. The next day, Edward went hunting, not with a bow, and not in the forest. He went hunting in the streets of Ashford, armed with nothing but friendly questions, and what he caught chilled him more than any beast ever had. He started at the bakery, because bakers know everything. The baker was a broad, cheerful man named Samuel Pratt, and his wife Margaret ran the counter. Edward bought sweet rolls he did not need, and mentioned, casually, what a fine inn the Silver Moon was. What a generous man that Harold Grant seemed to be. Oh yes, Samuel said quickly, very generous. Gives to the town fund every season. Fixed the church roof with his own money, he did. And the little girl who works there, Edward said. His ward, is she? Sweet child, works very hard. Something happened to the room. It was small, but Edward had spent a lifetime noticing small things. Samuel's hands, which had been wrapping rolls in paper, slowed down. Margaret, arranging loaves on a shelf, stopped arranging them. Neither of them looked at each other, and that was the tell, because married people always look at each other when a question surprises them, unless they have already agreed on the answer in advance. Elsie, Samuel said. Yes. Lucky girl. Master Grant took her in out of the goodness of his heart. She would have gone to the workhouse otherwise. Terrible places, workhouses. She seems tired, Edward said mildly. Thin, too. Children run themselves ragged at that age, Samuel said, and his voice had gone flat, like a man reading from a page. Growing girls are always thin. More rolls, sir? These are fresh from the oven. Margaret had turned around. She was looking at Edward now, and her eyes were doing something her mouth was not. There was a message in them, urgent and trapped, like a bird beating against a window. Her lips parted. She took a breath. Margaret, her husband said. Just her name, nothing more. But his hand came down on her arm, gently, the way you might steady someone at the edge of a drop, and the message in her eyes went out like a candle in the wind. She turned back to her loaves. Lovely town you have here, Edward said into the silence. The friendliest in the north, Samuel replied, and did not smile. It went the same way everywhere. At the blacksmith's forge, the smith praised Grant's charity for a full minute, and then found urgent work at the far end of the shop when Edward mentioned the girl. At the wool shop, the two old sisters who ran it talked over each other in their hurry to change the subject, suddenly desperate to sell him a scarf, 3 scarves, any number of scarves. At the well in the town square, a young mother pulling up water actually flinched at Elsie's name, gathered her bucket half full, and hurried away with water sloshing over her shoes. The town council clerk, a nervous man with ink stains on his fingers, gave Edward the strangest answer of all. Edward had asked, in his mild merchant's voice, whether the town kept records of orphaned children and their guardians, purely for professional curiosity, as he was thinking of funding a charity home in the region. The clerk's pen stopped moving. Records, he said. Well, yes. Records exist, but guardianship matters are. That is to say, Master Grant handles his own affairs privately, and the council has always found his paperwork to be, satisfactory. He is on the council himself, you understand. He is the treasurer. The treasurer, Edward repeated. 11 years now, the clerk said, and swallowed. Is there anything else, sir? I have a great deal of filing. By late afternoon, Edward understood the shape of the thing, and the shape of it was worse than a single cruel man. A single cruel man is a wound. What Ashford had was an infection. Grant had spent years wrapping himself in the town's own institutions, its church roof, its charity fund, its council seat, until pulling him out would tear the town's picture of itself apart. Every person who had taken his donations, accepted his festival bread, shaken his hand at church, had a small share in him now. To admit what he was, they would first have to admit what they were. People who had seen a thin girl with long sleeves in summer, year after year, and had chosen the comfortable story over the true one. They were not evil, most of them. That was the trap of it. They were ordinary. And ordinary people, Edward knew, will walk past almost anything, if walking past it is what everyone else is doing. He was crossing the square, turning all this over in his mind, when he saw Elsie herself. She had been sent to town on errands, a basket over her arm nearly as big as she was, and she was standing at the vegetable stall counting out coins with the terrible concentration of a child who knows that a single missing copper will have to be explained. The stall keeper, a heavy-set woman, watched the counting with her arms folded. 3 carrots rolled off the edge of the crowded stall. Elsie caught 2 against her body in a flash of quick hands, but the third hit the cobblestones, and Edward watched the girl's whole body go rigid, watched her snatch it up and hold it out to the stall keeper with both hands, head down, shoulders braced, whispering something over and over. It took him a moment to hear what it was. "It is not damaged. I promise. It is not damaged. Please check it. It is not damaged." The stall keeper took the carrot, looked at it, looked at the trembling child, and for one moment her face wavered. For one moment, something human moved behind her eyes. Then she glanced across the square, at the Silver Moon Inn, at the fat, prosperous shape of Harold Grant, laughing in its doorway with a customer, and her face closed like a shop shutter. "It is fine, girl," she said gruffly. "Go on home." Elsie went. She did not walk. She trotted, basket bouncing, past the church Grant's money had roofed, past the well where mothers went quiet at her name, past 40 people who all knew, and Edward stood in the middle of the friendliest town in the north, and felt something he had not felt in many years. He felt ashamed of people. That night, back in his room at the inn, he heard hooves in the yard, and looked out to see a dusty trader dismounting. A lean man, with gray at his temples, and eyes that missed nothing. Peter Hale had arrived, and with him a second rider, small and stooped, with a satchel of ledgers strapped to his saddle, the record clerk of the Northern Court. Edward met them in the stable, out of sight, and briefed them in a low voice for 10 minutes. Peter listened without interrupting, which was his way, and when Edward finished, the beta was quiet for a moment, looking up at the cheerful lamplit windows of the Silver Moon Inn. "The whole town," Peter said at last. "The whole town," Edward confirmed. Peter shook his head slowly. "What do you want first?" "Paper," Edward said. "Men like Grant always trust paper. They think numbers keep secrets. Find me the guardianship record. Find me where her parents' property went. Find me the wages he claims to pay her. I want his whole life in ink before I ever say my true name in this town." "And the girl?" Peter asked. "What about her, while we dig?" Edward looked up at the inn, at one small window at the back where no lamp burned, because candles cost money, and the girl who slept in the pantry was not worth one. "The girl thinks no one sees her," Edward said quietly. "Tomorrow night, that changes." It was the smell of bread that brought him downstairs. 3 in the morning, the whole town dark, the inn silent except for the settling of old timbers, and yet somewhere below, someone was baking. Edward moved without sound, a skill that had saved his life more than once, and paused at the kitchen door. Through the gap, he saw her. Elsie knelt on the stone floor with a scrubbing brush, working her way backward across flagstones that already looked clean to any reasonable eye. A single candle stub burned on the table, giving barely enough light to see by. On the hearth, a covered pot of dough sat rising near the banked coals, and the first loaves of the morning were already in the oven, which explained the smell, and also explained something that had bothered him since his first breakfast here. Grant's famous secret recipe, passed down from his dear mother, was the work of a 10-year-old girl baking alone in the dark while the town slept. In the corner of the pantry, through its open door, Edward could see a folded blanket on the floor, between a sack of flour and a shelf of preserves. A blanket, a small wooden box, and a tin cup. He understood that he was looking at the sum total of a child's world. That was where she slept. Not in a room. In the gap between the flour and the jam. He must have made some small sound. Or perhaps she simply felt the change in the air. because she spun around on her knees so fast that the brush skittered across the floor. Her face in the candlelight was pure fear, wide-eyed, bloodless. Her hands came up, not to defend herself, which broke something in him, but in a pleading gesture, palms out. "I am almost finished," she whispered. "I promise. The floors will be done before dawn. I only stopped to tend the bread, please. I was not resting." "I am not Master Grant," Edward said quietly. She blinked. Her eyes adjusted, found his face, and the panic dropped one level, from terror down to ordinary fear. Guests were not supposed to see her at night. That was clearly a rule too. He could see her small mind racing through the trouble this could bring. "Forgive me, sir. Did I wake you? I can make tea, or if you are hungry, there is cold meat, I can—" "You did not wake me," he said. "The bread did." He kept his voice low and even, the voice he used with frightened horses and shell-shocked soldiers. "It smells like the finest bakery in the capital. And I have eaten in the finest bakery in the capital, so I do not say it lightly." She stared at him. Somewhere in the oven, a crust crackled softly. "You made the bread I ate yesterday morning," he said. "Not Master Grant." Her eyes went to the door, checking, always checking, and then back to him. She did not confirm it. She had learned that truth was dangerous. But she did not deny it either, and her silence was its own answer. Edward did something then that no one in that town had done in 3 years. He pulled out a chair from the kitchen table, sat down at a 10-year-old servant girl's level, and asked her to teach him something. "I have always wondered," he said, "how bread like that is made. Would you show me? I will pay for the flour, if the cost worries you." It took her a long moment to understand that he was serious. He watched the suspicion, the confusion, the disbelief cross her small face one after another, like clouds crossing the moon. And then, cautiously, the way a wild creature approaches an open hand, she got up, wiped her palms on her patched dress, and fetched the flour jar. "You have to be patient with it," she said softly. "That is the secret. Everyone rushes the dough. You cannot rush it. It knows when you are angry, and it comes out heavy." "It knows when you are angry," Edward repeated. "I think so," she said seriously. "When I am sad, the bread is only ordinary. When I can make myself calm, it comes out light. So before I bake, I think about good things until my hands are quiet. Then I start." "What good things do you think about?" he asked. She measured flour by eye, no scales, her movements as sure as any master craftsman he had ever watched. "My mother had a blue apron with white flowers on it," she said. "She used to let me stand on a stool and knead beside her, and she would say, 'Well done, my little bird, you have the gift.'" She showed her hands to the candle, small and rough and strong. "These were her hands too," she said. "When I bake, it is like she is not all the way gone." Edward looked at this child, sleeping between the flour and the jam, working 18 hours a day, hiding fingertip bruises under long sleeves, and she had just told him that she baked with love, because it made the bread better for people who did not know her name. "Your mother was right," he said, when he could trust his voice. "You have the gift." For 1 hour, in a candlelit kitchen at the bottom of the night, Elsie was simply a child. She showed him how to fold the dough, and told him he was terrible at it, then clapped both hands over her mouth in horror at having said so, then actually laughed, one small startled note of laughter, when he agreed that he was terrible at it, and that his talents lay elsewhere. She told him about honey, how the summer honey and the autumn honey tasted different, how the miller's bees made the best of it. She asked him, shyly, what the capital was like, and whether it was true that the streets there were lit with lamps all night long. And when he said yes, every street, she was quiet for a while, and then said, "That must be nice, to have light whenever you need it." She never once complained. That was the thing he carried back up the stairs with him as the sky turned gray. Not one word against Grant, not one word of self-pity, nothing. She had been taught that her pain was not information anyone wanted, and so she had stopped offering it. All that was left was a small person tending bread in the dark, keeping her mother alive in her hands, thinking about good things, until her hands were quiet. At the kitchen door, he paused. "Elsie," he said. It was the first time he had used her name, and she looked up like a plant looks up at the sun. "The bread knows when you are angry," he said. "I will remember that." He climbed the stairs. In his room, he stood at the window and watched the dawn come up over the friendliest town in the north, and his hands, resting on the windowsill, were not quiet at all. Peter, he thought, dig fast. There was a fresh mark on her cheek at breakfast. Edward saw it the moment she came through the kitchen door, a reddened patch high on her left cheekbone that would darken by evening, and he had to set down his cup and place both hands flat on the table to keep them still. Something had happened in the hours since he had left that kitchen. Perhaps Grant had risen early and found some flaw only he could see. Perhaps there had been no reason at all. Men like Grant did not always need reasons. Sometimes the reason was simply that a storm needs somewhere to land. Elsie crossed the room with her tray, and before she even reached his table, the performance began. "Good morning, sir," she said, and then, in a bright, rehearsed voice, before he could ask anything at all, "I fell on the cellar stairs this morning. They are steep, and I was carrying too much. Master Grant says I must be more careful." Word for word, a prepared statement. A 10-year-old had been given lines, and had learned them, and the saddest part, the part that made Edward's jaw ache from clenching, was how good she was at it. The steady eyes, the little embarrassed smile, "Look how clumsy I am." If he had been any other guest, he would have believed her completely, clucked something sympathetic, and returned to his porridge. "Steep stairs are dangerous," he said evenly. "Yes, sir," she said, relieved, and moved on to the next table, where she repeated the same lines to a wool trader who barely glanced up. Grant appeared minutes later, and this morning he was magnificent. This morning he hovered. He carried a plate to Edward's table himself, sat down uninvited with a great show of friendliness, and steered the conversation, with the smoothness of a man guiding a boat, directly at the subject of the girl. "You may have noticed our Elsie took a tumble," he said, shaking his head fondly. "I have told her 100 times about those cellar stairs. But children never listen, do they? My own mother used to say I collected bruises like other boys collected stones." He laughed at his own charm. "I have half a mind to forbid her from the cellar entirely, but she insists on doing everything herself. Independent little thing. It is her best quality and her worst one." Every sentence did work. Edward watched it operate with the cold appreciation of a general studying an enemy's fortifications. Grant established the story, established that the story was old and familiar, established himself as the worried guardian, and folded the girl's injury into a charming tale about childhood in general. And through it all, Elsie stood by the counter, close enough to hear, being taught in real time that her own body's history belonged to Grant, that he would write the official version of everything that happened to her, and that the version would always be delivered with a smile. "She really is like a daughter to me," Grant finished, pressing a hand to his chest. "You said that on the day I arrived," Edward said pleasantly. "Did I?" Grant said, and laughed. "You did, word for word." For a fraction of a second, something flickered behind the innkeeper's eyes, a tiny stumble in the machinery, there and gone. Then the smile widened. "Well," he said, "when a thing is true, a man repeats it. More tea, sir?" Edward let him pour, and smiled, and asked a question about the wool market, and let Harold Grant walk away from that table believing he had won the morning. Let him believe it. Belief made men careless. Because while Grant was performing fatherly concern in the dining hall, 3 streets away, in the back room of the town record office, Peter Hale and the royal clerk were taking his life apart, 1 page at a time. They came to Edward that afternoon, meeting him in the stable under the cover of a pretended horse trade, and the clerk's hands were shaking as he opened his satchel, though whether from fear or fury, Edward could not at first tell. It turned out to be fury. The little clerk had spent 30 years serving the law of the northern kingdoms, and what he had found in Ashford's records offended him, the way a desecrated temple offends a priest. "Tell me," Edward said. "It is all here," the clerk said, spreading pages on a hay bale. The girl's parents were named Alfred and Rose Winter, small people, but not poor ones. They owned their cottage outright, 6 good acres behind it, and Alfred held a 1/3 share in the mill, inherited from his father. When the winter fever took them both within the same month, the child's inheritance should have been placed in trust with the council until she came of age. That is the law. That has been the law for 100 years. And instead, Edward said. "Instead," the clerk said, pulling out a page with a line of his own careful red ink underneath the signature, "Harold Grant filed a guardianship claim 9 days after the funerals." 9 days. The claim states that Alfred Winter owed him a substantial debt, and offers as proof a promissory note signed by Alfred. The council, of which Grant is treasurer, approved the claim in a single afternoon without independent review. The cottage, the acres, and the mill share were transferred to Grant as settlement of the debt, with the balance to be held by Grant in trust for the child. Peter spoke for the first time, and his voice was flat in the way it went, only when he was truly angry. "Show him the note." The clerk laid the promissory note beside another page, a land deed from years earlier bearing Alfred Winter's genuine signature, and even in the dim light of the stable, Edward could see it. The letters leaned the wrong way. The pressure of the pen was wrong. It was a competent forgery, good enough for a friendly council in a small town, nowhere near good enough for the Royal Record Office. "There is more," the clerk said. "Grant's own books, the ones he files with the council each year as treasurer. He lists a wage paid to one kitchen worker, a girl, at 4 coppers a week, which he then lists as returned to him in full for her room and board. 4 coppers, marked out and taken back, every week, for 3 years, in his own handwriting. He is not only working the child without pay, he has built a paper trail to make it look lawful." He nudged one final page across the hay. "And this, the trust he holds for her, the balance from her parents' property, 200 crowns, entered 3 years ago. Current balance," Edward said. The clerk's ink-stained finger came down on a number at the bottom of a column. "0, he said, "drawn out over 3 years in small amounts. The last withdrawal paid for the new sign above his front door. The one that says the Silver Moon Inn, the friendliest welcome in the north." The stable was quiet. A horse shifted in its stall. Somewhere outside, the town went about its cheerful afternoon, and inside the inn, a small girl with a mark on her cheek was scrubbing pots that were, by every law of the northern kingdoms, partly paid for with her own stolen inheritance. Edward looked at the pages for a long time. "Copy everything," he said at last. "Certified copies, under the royal clerk's seal. Touch nothing original until I say. And Peter." He looked up, and Peter Hale, who had stood beside his king through war and treachery and grief, actually took a half-step back from what he saw in his face. "Find out if there were others before her. Men who do this do not begin at 50. There will be a trail. Find it." "There was a name," Peter said quietly. "The laundrywoman let it slip this morning, and then turned white and would not say another word. A girl who worked at the inn some years back and left in disgrace, accused of stealing." "What name?" Edward said. "Lucy," said Peter. "The girl was called Lucy." The note came under his door at midnight, pushed through the gap by a hand that did not knock, and footsteps that were gone before he reached the corridor. It was written on bakery paper, the kind used to wrap sweet rolls, in a hurried, uneven hand. "She is not the first girl. Ask about Lucy. 2 towns east, in Marlow, works at the dye house. Please. I cannot say more. I have children of my own." There was no signature, but Edward did not need one. He had seen those eyes over a bakery counter, beating against the window of a marriage and a town and a silence, and he found he could forgive Margaret Pratt a great deal for the courage of that unsigned paper. It is easy to judge the silent from a throne. It is harder from a small house with children sleeping in it, in a town where one man controls the council, the charity fund, and the story everyone has agreed to tell. Peter rode east before dawn. He was gone 2 days, and they were the longest 2 days of Edward's reign. He filled them by being the perfect guest, praising Grant's inn, losing small sums to him at cards in the evenings, and watching the man's eyes shine as he raked in the coins. He filled them by drinking cold tea, so that a small girl would have a reason to bring him a hot cup, and by leaving his boots outside his door dirtier than they needed to be, because he had discovered that Grant credited Elsie a copper for boot cleaning in his ledgers, and then took it back. But the work itself was done sitting down, in the warm, and was the closest thing to rest the child's day contained. Small mercies, delivered by stealth. It was all he could permit himself yet, and it tasted like ash. On the second evening, Peter returned, and one look at his face told Edward that the trail had been found, and that it was bad. They met in the stable again, by lantern light. Peter sat down on the hay bale like a man setting down a heavy load, and for a while he just looked at the lantern flame. "Her name is Lucy Marsh," he said finally. "She is 16 now. She was 13 when she left Ashford. She works 14 hours a day at the dye house in Marlow, and she lives in a rented room with 3 other girls, and when I told her I had come from Ashford, she put her back against the wall and looked at the door, and I have seen soldiers do exactly that, Edward, in exactly that way. "Tell me all of it," Edward said. "Her parents died when she was 9, Peter said. "River accident. Grant took her in, and the town called him a saint for it. And for 4 years she lived exactly the life the winter girl is living now. The work, the pantry floor, the long sleeves, the stairs she was always falling down. Word for word, Edward, the same script, 10 years apart. He forged papers over her parents' fishing boat and nets. Small property, but hers. And when she turned 13, she did something the winter girl has not done yet. She told someone." The lantern hissed softly. "She told the priest," Peter said. "The old one, before this current man. She showed him the marks and told him everything, and the priest, to his credit, raised it with the council. And Grant stood up in front of that council, wounded and dignified, and produced a silver candlestick from Lucy's sleeping place in the pantry, and tearfully explained that he had suspected the girl of stealing for months, but had said nothing out of love. He wept, Edward. 3 separate people described his weeping to me, and 2 of them still believe it was real. They branded her a thief," Edward said. "They branded her a thief and a liar in one afternoon," Peter said. "No trial, of course. She was a child, and it never went to law. Just the judgment of the town, which is worse, because there is no appeal from that." Grant magnanimously declined to press the matter, which everyone praised as further proof of his kindness, and Lucy Marsh walked out of Ashford at 13 years old with 1 bag, in winter, and the town watched her go and told itself a comfortable story about ungrateful orphans. The old priest died the following year. The new one has Grant's donations to thank for his roof, his stipend, and his stained glass window. Edward stood in the lantern light, absorbing it. This was the true architecture of the thing, and it was worse than forged papers and stolen crowns. Grant had not merely silenced one girl, he had inoculated the entire town. He had staged a trial of truth itself, rigged it, and won, and now every soul in Ashford carried the verdict in them. If a girl from the Silver Moon Inn ever says such things, she is a liar and a thief. We have seen this before. Elsie was locked inside a story that had been built and tested before she could even talk. "That is why the town looks away," Peter said, following his thought as he always did. "Half of them are afraid of Grant, but the other half are afraid of something worse. If Lucy Marsh was telling the truth, then they did what they did to a truthful child. People will defend a comfortable lie to the grave, because the alternative is a mirror." "Will she testify?" Edward asked. Peter was quiet for a moment. "I did not tell her who I served," he said. "I told her only that a man of authority was gathering evidence against Harold Grant, and that there was another girl in that pantry now, 10 years old. And Edward, this child, because she is still a child in every way that matters, this child who has every reason to want to be left alone for the rest of her life," went silent for a long moment, and then she said, 10. "The same age I was when it started getting bad." And then she said, and I will remember her saying it until I die, she said, "I told the truth once and it cost me everything I had left. Tell your man of authority I will tell it again, and this time he had better be listening." Edward turned and looked through the stable door, across the dark yard, at the inn, where a candle stub was burning low in the kitchen window, because a small girl was finishing floors at midnight. "He is listening," Edward said. "Bring her to the border fort. Guards she can trust, a good room, and the royal physician, she has likely never seen one. And send word to the capital. I want Justice Marion Cole and 2 magistrates of the High Court on the North Road by tomorrow evening, under trade banners, no royal colors." Peter rose. "It is enough then," he said. "The forged note, the ledgers, the emptied trust, Lucy's testimony. It is more than enough. We could take him tonight." "We could," Edward agreed, "and the town would tell itself a new comfortable story by spring. A powerful stranger passed through and took against poor Master Grant, who was always so kind. No, Peter." He looked out at the sleeping town, at the church roof paid for with stolen inheritances, at the friendliest welcome in the north. "Grant is not the whole sickness. He is only the oldest part of it. When this ends, it ends in front of every eye in Ashford, in a way that no one can look away from, ever again." He blew out the lantern. 3 more days, then we hold up the mirror." On the morning of the 3rd day, Edward announced that he was leaving, and he did it in the most dangerous way possible. He did it generously. He came down to breakfast in his traveling clothes, and told Harold Grant, with every appearance of warm regret, that business called him onward at last. 10 days in Ashford, he said, had been the finest rest of his year. The food, the hospitality, the company. He wished to thank the town properly before he went. He wished, in fact, to host a farewell feast. Tomorrow evening. The whole town invited. Every man, woman, and child. All of it, at his own expense. In the square outside the Silver Moon Inn, with the inn's kitchen providing the food, and Master Grant, naturally, presiding as host beside him. He watched greed and vanity light Grant up like a festival lamp. A feast for the whole town, paid for by a rich stranger, with Harold Grant at the head table in front of every neighbor he had spent 20 years performing for. The man could no more refuse it than a moth could refuse a flame. "Sir," Grant said, pressing both hands to his heart, "Ashford will never forget this evening. I promise you that." "No," Edward agreed. "I do not believe it will." "There was one condition," Edward added lightly, as if it had just occurred to him. "Everyone must attend." He had traveled widely, he said, and had a superstition about farewell feasts, that an empty chair at one brought bad luck on the road. Grant, delighted to enforce anything on his neighbors, promised that the whole town would be there, if he had to carry them himself. He spent the rest of the day striding around Ashford spreading the news, and Edward watched from the inn window as the town received it. The excitement, the relief too on certain faces, because the watchful stranger was finally leaving, and the questions would leave with him, and everything could go back to the way it had always comfortably been. Underneath the festival noise, in the quiet layer of the day where real things happen, other pieces were moving. A wool trader arrived at the inn around noon, and took 2 rooms for his sons. The trader was a Royal Guard captain named Arthur Bell, and his sons were the 2 most decorated soldiers of the Northern Watch. A tinker's wagon broke an axle, with much loud cursing, directly across the square from the inn, in the one position from which every door of the building could be watched, and the tinker settled in to repair it with unhurried thoroughness. The tinker had commanded the crossbow line at the Battle of the Frost Pass. By dusk, without one visible weapon or one raised voice, the Silver Moon Inn sat inside a closed fist. And 30 miles east, in a guarded room at the border fort, Justice Marion Cole of the High Court, a gray woman with 40 years of law behind her eyes, sat listening to a 16-year-old girl tell her story, from beginning to end, while 2 magistrates wrote down every word, and the royal clerk laid certified pages in front of her one by one. The forged note, the vanished trust, the ledgers. When Lucy Marsh finished speaking, Justice Cole, who had sentenced warlords without blinking, sat in silence for a long moment. Then she said, "We ride at first light." Edward's last act of the day was the one that mattered most, and it was the smallest. He found Elsie in the yard at dusk, hauling in the washing before the dew came down, and he crouched to help her fold a sheet, which flustered her completely, because guests did not touch washing, and this guest kept breaking rules she did not have names for. "I leave after the feast tomorrow," he said quietly, working the fold. "Yes, sir." Her voice was carefully empty. "I heard. It will be a fine feast. Elsie." He waited until she looked at him. Her eyes in the dusk were guarded, but underneath the guard, buried deep where she thought no one could see it, was the disappointment of a child who had let herself, for a week and a half, feel slightly less alone, and was now paying the bill for it. It cut him worse than anger would have. "I need you to trust me tomorrow," he said. "Whatever happens at the feast, whatever you see or hear, you are safe, safer than you have ever been. I need you to remember one thing for me. Can you do that?" She nodded slowly, folding on autopilot, her whole attention on his face. "When I take off my cloak," he said, "come stand next to me. That is all. No matter what is happening, no matter what anyone says, when the cloak comes off, you walk to me. Will you do it?" "Why?" she whispered. "Because the bread knows when you are angry," he said, "and I want you standing where you can watch me stay calm." It was not an answer, and she knew it was not an answer, and she was far too intelligent to be fooled, and far too well trained to press a guest with questions. But something older than logic passed between them over the folded sheet, the same current that had passed in the midnight kitchen, and after a moment, she nodded. "When the cloak comes off," she said, "I will come." That night, Edward stood at his window for a long time. The town lay below him, lamplit and peaceful, humming with anticipation of tomorrow's feast. In the kitchen underneath his feet, Elsie was baking through the night, because Grant had ordered enough bread for 300 people, and it never once occurred to him that there was anything remarkable in assigning that to a 10-year-old, and it never once occurred to her that she could refuse. 300 loaves, Edward thought. She is baking the bread for her own liberation, and she does not know it. Far to the east, a line of riders moved along the dark road under plain trade banners. A judge, 2 magistrates, a clerk with a satchel of certified truth, and a 16-year-old girl who had waited 3 years for someone to be listening. Above them all, the moon rose full over the northern kingdoms, and if the wolves in the hills sang to it a little longer than usual that night, only the sheepdogs of Ashford seemed to notice, and no one heeds a dog on the eve of a feast. The trap was set. The town had invited itself. All that remained was tomorrow. The feast began at sundown, and Ashford had never seen anything like it. Long tables ran the length of the square, lanterns swung from every post, and the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread rolled through the streets like a warm tide. 300 people came, because Harold Grant had made sure of it, farmers and traders, the blacksmith and his sons, the priest, the full town council, the baker and his wife, mothers with babies, old men who had not left their firesides in years. Every soul in town, gathered in one place, exactly as the stranger's superstition required. Grant presided from the head table in his finest coat, glowing, expansive, rising every few minutes to propose another toast, to Ashford, to friendship, to their generous guest. He was having the greatest evening of his life. Beside him, Edward sat in his dark traveling cloak, drank little, and watched the square the way a chess player watches the board in the final minutes of a long game. Elsie worked the tables, of course she did. 300 guests, and the girl who had baked all night was now serving all evening, weaving between benches, with loaded trays, invisible as ever, to the town she was feeding. Edward tracked her through the crowd without ever appearing to, and noted, with cold satisfaction, that wherever she went, the tinker mending his axle had a clear line of sight, and the wool trader's quiet sons were never more than 20 feet away. It happened 2 hours in, and it happened over almost nothing, which was fitting, because it had always been almost nothing. A dropped spoon, a stumble on a step, a plate. Elsie was clearing the council's table, when a heavy man leaned back suddenly, laughing at his own joke, and his elbow caught her loaded tray. 6 plates went down, the crash cut through the music and chatter, and 300 faces turned toward the sound, and there she stood, in the sudden quiet, a small girl in a ring of broken crockery, that everyone had just watched someone else cause. And the town did what the town had trained itself to do. It looked away. Conversations restarted a little too loudly. Eyes found other things to study. 300 people gave one child to the wolf, by reflex, without even the courtesy of a decision. Grant rose from the head table. His face, for the audience, was fond exasperation. The patient guardian. Here we go again. He crossed the square unhurried, took Elsie by the upper arm in a grip that looked gentle from 10 feet away and was not, and steered her toward the inn's kitchen door, and Edward heard him say, in his warm public voice, "Come along, child, let us get you cleaned up," and under it, pitched for her ears alone, 6 words that made her face go white. "We will discuss this in private." They went through the kitchen door, and the town breathed out, relieved, and reached for its cider, because the small unpleasantness was over now, and would be dealt with elsewhere, out of sight, the way it always was, the way was comfortable. Except that tonight, for the first time in 10 years, elsewhere was occupied. Grant marched the girl into his kitchen, his grip tightening now that no one could see, his hand already rising, and walked straight into Edward Stone. The king was standing in the middle of the kitchen, and there was no possible way he could have gotten there, because Grant had left him seated at the head table 30 seconds ago, in front of the whole town. But wolves move as wolves move, and there he was. Behind him, filling the back doorway, stood 2 soldiers who had been the wool trader's sons all week, and neither of them looked like anyone's son now. Grant's raised hand froze in the air. Edward caught it. He did not strike it aside, did not twist it. He simply closed his own hand around the innkeeper's wrist, mid-swing, and held it there, with a strength that ended every question Grant's body might have asked, and in the silence, he spoke one sentence, quietly, almost gently. "That hand has landed on this child for the last time in its life." "Sir," Grant stammered, and the famous voice, the voice that had wept before a council and roofed a church, came apart in his throat. "Sir, you misunderstand. This is a family matter. The girl is my ward. I have every right." Edward walked him backward through the kitchen door, out into the square, into the lantern light, in front of 300 people, still holding the raised wrist high, where every eye could see exactly what it was, and exactly what it had been about to do. The music stopped. The square went silent, silent in a way that no crowd of 300 should be able to be, silent all the way down. Then Edward Stone let go of the wrist, reached up, and took off his cloak. There are things a North Country crowd knows by instinct, from banners and coins and the stories their grandmothers told them, and one of those things is the sight of the royal crest of the Northern Kingdoms worked in silver thread across a black tunic, the running wolf under the crown of stars. A sound went through the square, 300 people inhaling at once, and then the front rows began to kneel, and then it spread outward, like wind through wheat, benches scraping, knees hitting stone, until the only people left standing in the whole of Ashford were a king, an innkeeper, swaying on his feet with his face the color of ash, and one small girl in the kitchen doorway. Elsie stood frozen, a broken plate still in her hand. Then she remembered. "When the cloak comes off, come stand next to me." And in front of the kneeling town, the invisible girl walked out of the kitchen, down the steps, across the open stones, and took her place at the right hand of the Alpha King, and Edward swept the cloak around her shoulders, royal crest and all, and rested one hand there, light as a promise. He looked out over the square, over every bowed head, and when he spoke, he did not raise his voice, because he did not need to, because you could have heard a feather land. "My name is Edward Stone," he said. "I have sat among you for 10 days. I have eaten this child's bread, which you were told was another's. I have heard this child blamed for stairs, for wagons, for other men's elbows. I have watched 300 pairs of eyes practice not seeing her." He turned his head slowly, until his gaze came to rest on Harold Grant, and Grant made a small sound, and sat down on the cobblestones like a puppet with cut strings. "You should have hidden your sins," Edward said, as well as she hid her bruises. And into the ringing silence, from the darkness at the edge of the square, came the sound of hooves, many hooves, arriving exactly on time, and torchlight, and the trade banners falling away from the riders, to show the colors of the High Court of the Northern Kingdoms. And at the front of the column, beside a gray judge in traveling robes, rode a 16-year-old girl, who was seeing Ashford again, for the first time in 3 years, and who was done, forever, with waiting to be believed. "Court is now in session," said Justice Marion Cole. They held the trial in the square that same night, by torchlight, at the feast tables, because Justice Marion Cole had learned in 40 years of law that truth loses weight every hour it is delayed, and because Edward wanted it exactly this way, in the open, at the scene, with the food still on the plates. No courtroom in the capital. The town itself would be the courtroom. The town itself, in a sense, was on trial. Grant was seated alone at the head table, where he had toasted himself 2 hours before, flanked by soldiers, and the change in him was terrible to see. Without the audience's belief to feed on, the whole warm apparatus of the man had collapsed, and what remained looked small and gray and ordinary, and that ordinariness was its own lesson, one the town would chew on for years. Monsters, it turned out, did not look like monsters. They looked like the treasurer. The clerk read the documents first, in his precise, ink-stained voice, and every page landed on the square like a stone into still water. The guardianship claim filed 9 days after the funerals. The promissory note, held up beside Alfred Winter's true signature, close enough for a lazy counsel, laughable under a magistrate's glass. The cottage, the 6 acres, the mill share, the trust of 200 crowns, and the slow 3-year theft of it, entry by entry, in Grant's own hand, and when the clerk read out the final withdrawal, the one that had paid for the sign above the inn door, the friendliest welcome in the north, a sound moved through the crowd that was half groan and half moan, the sound of a comfortable story dying in 300 chests at once. Then Justice Cole said, "The court calls Lucy Marsh," and the town stopped breathing. She walked to the front, with her back straight, and her hands steady, 16 years old, and she looked out at the faces she had last seen watching her leave in the snow, the same faces, 3 years older, and she did not flinch from a single one of them. She told it all. The 4 years, the work, the pantry, the sleeves. The day she showed the old priest her arms, and then the council meeting, and the silver candlestick produced from her blankets, and Grant's weeping, and she looked directly at the men of the council, seated together halfway down the square, and said quietly, "You were there. You watched him cry, and you called it kindness. I was 13. I weighed less than the feast table you are sitting at, and not one of you asked me a single question before you decided what I was. You could hear the torches burning. That was all you could hear." Elsie sat wrapped in the king's cloak through all of it, and Edward watched her listen to Lucy, watched her understand, in real time, that the script of her own life had been performed before, word for word, on another girl, that the stairs and the sleeves and the shame were not her private fate but a design, and he watched something shift behind her eyes forever. It is a strange gift, but a great one, to learn at 10, that the voice telling you that you are worthless has said the same lines to someone else. It stops being truth. It becomes only a script, and scripts can be burned. Justice Cole rendered the legal verdict swiftly, because legally there was nothing difficult about it. Forgery of instruments of debt, theft of an inheritance held in trust, falsification of council records, perjury before a lawful body, cruelty toward children given into his care, testified and evidenced. Harold Grant was stripped of the inn, the cottage, the acres, the mill share, and every crown he possessed, all of it ordered into restitution for Lucy Marsh and Elsie Winter, and he himself was sentenced to the northern work camps for a term long enough that he would enter them a gray man and leave them an old one, and he said nothing, because there was nothing left in him to say. The performance was over, and there had never been anything underneath it. But then, when the soldiers moved to take him away, and the town began to stir with the release of it, with the eagerness of people preparing to tell themselves the next comfortable story, the one where they had all been fooled, all victims together, all innocent, Edward Stone rose to his feet, and the stirring died. "The court has judged the man," Edward said. "I am not finished with the town." He came out from behind the table, and walked slowly along the square, and where he passed, people found the ground very interesting. "I will not sentence you," he said. "You have broken no written law. There is no statute against looking away, but there is tonight, in this square, a debt of truth, and it will be paid before anyone sleeps." He stopped at the center, beside Elsie, and his voice never rose, and it reached every wall. "Each of you saw something. A thin child in summer sleeves, a flinch at a raised voice, a girl buying vegetables with fear in her hands. You will stand, one at a time, and you will say aloud what you saw and when you saw it. You will say it in front of this child, and in front of Lucy Marsh, and in front of each other, not to be punished, to be cured, because your silence was a wall, and every stone in it had a name on it, and tonight the wall comes down stone by stone." And it did. It took hours. The stall-keeper stood first, to her credit, shaking, and said, "The carrot. 3 weeks ago, she begged me over a carrot, and I saw her eyes, and I sold her turnips, and said nothing. Then the laundrywoman. Then the blacksmith, who wept. The councilman, one by one, each confession pulling the next one out of the dark. The town telling itself the true story of itself, for the first time in 10 years. And Margaret Pratt stood up with her unsigned note held out in front of her, and claimed it aloud, and Samuel stood beside her with his hand on her shoulder, in front of everyone, where it should have been all along. Elsie listened to all of it from inside the king's cloak. Somewhere past midnight, Lucy Marsh came and sat beside her, and the two of them, 10 and 16, sat shoulder to shoulder, while the town that had failed them said so, out loud, 300 times. The last stars were fading when it ended. Justice Cole closed the session, and as the townspeople moved off through the gray light to their houses, none of them speaking, all of them changed. Edward looked down, and found Elsie asleep at last, against Lucy's arm, her face, for the first time since he had met her, completely unguarded. The silence that had protected Harold Grant for 10 years was gone. In its place was a different silence, the silence of a town walking home at dawn carrying its own name, and that silence would protect Elsie Winter for the rest of her life. Elsie Winter left Ashford on a spring morning, riding in front of the Alpha King on a gray horse, wearing a new blue coat, and it must be recorded, for the sake of the full truth, that she was terrified. Not of Edward, of everything else. She had asked him, in a small voice, the night before they left, whether she was going to the capital as a servant, And if so, whose? And whether the head cook there was kind. And Edward had understood, with a fresh ache, that even now, even free, her imagination could not build a picture of a future in which she was not the smallest person in someone else's house. He had knelt down to her level, as he had in the midnight kitchen, and said, "You are going as my ward. That word has hurt you before, so hear what it means when I say it. It means a room with a window and a lamp you may burn all night. It means you eat first, not last. It means teachers. It means no one raises a hand or a voice to you ever again, and if anyone tries, they will answer to the crown. And it means that if you never lift a single tray for the rest of your life, you will still belong there." She had thought about this seriously, in the way she thought about everything, and then asked her one question: "Is there a kitchen?" The palace kitchens, it turned out, were the finest in the northern kingdoms, and their ruler was a round, thunderous, magnificent woman named head cook Brenda Hart, who had fed 3 kings and feared nothing on this earth. When Edward brought the small girl down to meet her, Brenda looked her over once, top to bottom, and said, "So you are the bread girl. His Majesty has talked my ear off about your bread." And Elsie, palace shy, whispered that it was only ordinary bread, and Brenda Hart drew herself up like a storm front and declared that in her kitchen, no one spoke lies, and the girl would bake for her that afternoon, and they would establish the facts. Elsie baked. Brenda tore off a piece of the warm loaf, ate it slowly, looked at the 10-year-old for a long moment, and said, "Well, I have been doing it wrong for 30 years, apparently." And that was that. What followed took months, because healing is not an event but a season, and it does not travel in a straight line. There were bad nights, there were mornings when Elsie was found scrubbing her own floor before dawn, because her hands did not yet believe the news, and no one scolded her. And slowly, the mornings changed. There was the first time she broke a plate in the palace kitchens, and went white and rigid, waiting, and the whole kitchen simply carried on. And a boy her age swept it up whistling, and she stood there confused while nothing happened, and nothing kept happening, and something knotted inside her since she was 7 years old began, that day, to come undone. She learned to read that summer, fast and hungrily. She grew. The hollows left her cheeks. The physician confirmed what the bread had always suggested, that she was, underneath everything, tremendously strong. And she cooked, not because she must, but because she chose to, and the difference remade the act entirely. She stood on a stool beside Brenda Hart, the way she had once stood beside her mother, and if you had passed the palace kitchens on any given evening that year, you might have heard, over the clatter, the sound the whole staff came to listen for: a girl laughing. Lucy Marsh took her restitution and did a thing that made the whole North talk. She went back to Ashford. She stood in the square where she had been called a thief, and she bought, with her own restored inheritance and the crown's blessing, the Silver Moon Inn itself, and she gutted it, scrubbed every stone of it, tore down the old sign, and reopened it as Winter House, a home for orphan children, funded forever by the confiscated wealth of Harold Grant, staffed by, of all people, the townsfolk of Ashford, who came to her one by one, the stall-keeper, the laundry-woman, Margaret Pratt, asking to help, needing to help, and were put to work. Justice Cole remarked in her dry way that it was the only sentence she had ever seen a town serve voluntarily. The pantry where 2 girls had slept between the flour and the jam became a proper bedroom, small and warm, with a lamp that was allowed to burn all night, kept always ready for any child who arrived afraid of the dark. Edward visited the following spring, unannounced as always, and found the yard full of children, the kitchen full of bread smell, and a plaque above the kitchen door: plain oak, well made, carved by the blacksmith who had wept at the trial. It carried a single sentence, the one the town had chosen to keep, the one mothers in Ashford now taught their children before they taught them their letters, so that no one growing up in that town would ever again mistake looking away for innocence. You should have hidden your sins as well as she hid her bruises. Elsie came north with him on that visit, 13 now, taller, loud in her laughter, a girl with a future measured in open road. She stood in the doorway of the old kitchen for a long time, looking at the corner by the flour sacks, and Edward stood beside her and let her look. Then she rolled up her sleeves, both sleeves, all the way, freely, in front of everyone, because her arms were simply arms now, and had been for years, and she said, "Well, these children have clearly never had proper bread," and went to work, and Lucy grinned. and the kitchen filled with orphans, learning to fold dough from the most famous young baker in the northern kingdoms. Edward watched from the doorway, and Peter Hale, beside him, said quietly, 10 days. You changed all of this in 10 days, because you looked at a serving girl. No, Edward said. He watched Elsie guide a small boy's hands through the fold. Patient, patient. You cannot rush it. It knows when you are angry. Everyone looked at her. Looking is easy. He turned to go. King's business waiting. The whole north waiting, and paused at the door for one last breath of that warm bread air. The whole difference, he said, is that I did not look away. And in the kitchen behind him, the ovens were warm, the light was good, and the bread, by every account ever given afterward, came out perfectly, because the hands that made it were finally, completely quiet.